spoken request this evening that you have any needs, unsaved loved ones or unloved saved ones. Let's pray for all of them. Could we go before the Lord? Dear Jesus, we thank you tonight for your mercies and your goodness to us. We see these many requests that are represented by these, your people. I pray that your Spirit would move to take care of these things that are needs in our lives, that you would help with the situation of Kitty, ease Brother Rick's situation, give him speedy healing, oh God, and recovery from all of his trauma and turmoil from this fall. Lord, that you keep your hand upon those who are away and traveling back during this week, oh Lord. Keep safety, oh God, as they move from one location to another. That your Spirit be with each of us as our needs are brought before you tonight, oh God. You're a supplier of all that we have need of. There are needs of finance, there are needs of emotional, spiritual health, dear oh God, of strength and deliverance. We pray that your Spirit would move. And we know that you're the meter of all our needs, the supplier of all our wants. Would you be with us in Jesus? Please. And it's good to have our team class with us this evening. This is a good-looking group. And I'm just glad that they can be here. Right up here where I get a good view of all of them. They get a good view of me. I got the best end of that deal. And we want to welcome me. Some may be here for the first time. If so, welcome. Come back again. And we need to take an offering this evening. And let's see if maybe Brother Charlotte could come and help us. And also Brother Wayne. Could you help us right back there near the same area? Thank you. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you, Savior, for your mercies, blessings in providing for us, and bless this offering as we give into your work tonight. Oh, Lord, use it for the benefit of your kingdom, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Lord bless you as you give. And the junior quizzers, I regret to inform you that they were 2 up and 2 down. Had 2 quizzes and ran into real good teams. We had a good team in here. I may be a little prejudiced about that, but they just in the draw and the way the matrix was set up, their first 2 times out of the chute, they ran into teams that, at least for those quizzes, were better than they were, so they are through in the double elimination contest. But I do know this, that the word that they have hidden in their hearts, they will not lose it. You sow it, it will be there. Praise God. Praise the Lord. Well, let me see if we can do a little something with some scriptures in the Word of the Lord tonight. I have mentioned before that we have in this church, in the 2 Beardsleys and me, 3 very different kinds of ministry, 3 very different looks and outlooks of the world, different capabilities, different places that we came from, although there are many similarities in Brother Beardsley's background and mine. He was actually a rocket scientist while I was just studying to be one, an aerospace engineer. At the time God called me to preach. We both have established churches, built churches for the Lord, and yet for all of the similarities, there are differences of approach. A lot of times, Stephen will take a scripture and we'll just peel it back like an onion, just layer after layer of meaning, and teach us things about it that you just sit there sometimes with your mouth open saying, where did he find all of that in those words that I've looked at over and over? I didn't see that, but he can bring it out in such an excellent way. And then, of course, Brother Beardsley has such a burden and a love for people. If you can fog up a mirror, Brother Beardsley loves you. and it comes out in his preaching. I spent, as many of you know, 46 years as pastor of one church. I always told them that I had if things came apart, I had the excellent excuse that it was just my first pastorate. And that was justification for anything that went wrong. I never had to use that excuse, but I always kept it, set aside just in case. And as a pastor, quite often I would teach. My ministry seems to be largely teaching, but in a different way than your pastor's method of teaching. I used to, when I was pastoring, quite frequently do a series of teachings. One time I did the entire book of Hebrews, another time the book of Acts. I've gone through various studies of the life of David, the life of Abraham. I don't have the opportunity here, and I'm not asking for that kind of opportunity to do a long-term series like that. I did one just shortly before I resigned as pastor there on spiritual warfare. I think it was every Wednesday night that I was in town for about, was that a year and a half or 2.5 years? I forget which it was. So you can see I can't do that kind of thing here. And so I have a fallback position of what I have used much of the time here is what might be called kind of like special speaker. And I hope that is not off-putting to you, but here we go. And I've got 3 scriptures that I want to use tonight. One of them from the book of Colossians, one from the book of Philemon, and then the third one will be from 2 Timothy. And while you are looking up Colossians 4 and 14, and in case you're writing them down, you're going to get them all at once. Philemon, verse 23. There's only one chapter, so it's verse 23. Colossians 4:14, Philemon 1:23, and 2 Timothy 4 and 9. I believe it was this Sunday that your pastor talked to us about our trip to Turkey several years ago when we visited the ruins of a place called Colossus. The book of Colossians was written to a church in that town. And Stephen described it as a place, as so many others, that it was a good place to build a town, so they built one there, and then it was destroyed, and it was still a good place to have a town, so they built another one on top of that, and through the centuries, that one was destroyed, and they just kept building and building until the last of it, the last time it was destroyed, it left at the end of it a very high hill, or what they call in the Middle East a tell, T-E-L. And about the bus getting there, and it was sprinkling very lightly. And he didn't even get off the bus because there has been no excavation there. There's been nothing that has been dug up. There's no museum. There are no things to see. It's just a dirt mound is all you can see. And so he did not get out while several of us did. I was one of those. I didn't go all the way to the top, but I did climb at least part way up the hill. And he said there was no digging going on there, but I've got to disagree with that because I took a picture of the only excavation work that was going on there. There were some ants that were digging hole, and so I got a picture of the only excavation work going on at Colossus. He explained to you his feeling of the situation, but I've brought something away from our stop at Colossus, and I want to share that with you just a moment while you're looking up these scriptures and before I get into them, that there are some people, I doubt that there's anyone in this church who feels this way, but there are some people that are not missionary minded. One time I had a man in Bartlesville when we were running about 15 or 20 people all week long who chided me a little bit about our missions outreach. And he was saying, what are you doing reaching for all those people when you haven't reached Bartlesville? Well, the Lord told us, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth, and he didn't say we had to complete one part of that before we got started on the next part. But as I stood there looking out across that area and thinking of all the places we had already been before we got to Colossus, and then at Colossus that day in a place that had been a thriving town with a church dynamic enough that the Apostle Paul wrote to them with instructions. And now it was just a hill. And it occurred to me, if we had depended only on what we could build in Colossus, the Christian message would have died out. But since it was spread from city to village to town to village to city and all over the world, it was not really all that much of a tragedy when one city collapsed, when one church closed, because the message went on. And that's what we're doing. You look at that row of plaques at the back of all of those missionaries that are being supported by this church. I'm not anticipating that anything is going to happen here, but if it did, if somebody should decide to drop a bomb right in this area, from here you catch New York and D.C. both with something dropped about here. Then even if we disappeared in a puff of smoke, the message would go on, because there's the message all over the world. And it wouldn't have to be anything that dramatic, but it just spoke to me that if I can keep not only the home fire burning, but kindle fires or help to kindle fires in other places, that we're fulfilling the work of God. And even if something happens, as I said about my situation in Bartlesville, if something had gone wrong, I had an excuse. I don't need an excuse, and I don't want an excuse, but I make the joke if I had the excuse. But even if that had not been successful, we would have already, at the time that man chided me a little bit about what we were doing for missions, we were already involved in making sure that the message did not die out, because it wasn't dependent on just one place. And that's that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks, but don't forget the $5. All right, let's go to Colossians chapter 4. verse 14. And it's just Paul's closing of his letter. And he's doing what I have labeled as the roll call. Several of his letters end with him writing out the names of people that are involved with him, that he's working with, or that he's sending greetings to. And so it's a part of his letter. He generally starts out Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and then he ends up somewhere toward the end with this list of names of people that he is saying they send their greetings and hello to you from this one, and by the way, greet so-and-so for me where you are. And in Colossians 4 and 14, he gets to this point in the list, and he says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Nobody's running the aisles. Isn't that exciting? Doesn't that just stir you up? No, I guess not. Okay. How about in Philemon, verse number 23? There salute thee, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus. And then verse 24, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers. So in this instance, he's got two men listed that he names also in Colossians. Luke is Lucas, and Demas, and he calls them my fellow laborers. And then in 2 Timothy, chapter 4, and we'll begin with, or chapter 4, and begin with verse 9. Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. Verse 10, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Demas, a man who was part of the gospel team that traveled with Paul and was involved in building churches across the then known world of the Roman Empire. Demas, a man who, when Paul started to write of those that were with him and was talking about his friends that were involved and that were getting something done for Jesus, he put Demas on the same level, in the same verse, with the physician Luke, the man who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. He wrote two books in the New Testament. And Paul, when he was writing about who he was working with, who his friends were, who was important to him, who he wanted the other churches to recognize, he put Luke and Demas in the same verse, right next to each other. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas, they greet you. And so this tells me that Demas was not just a hanger-on. Demas wasn't just somebody who was a groupie. That he was somebody who was, by Paul, labeled, classified in that inner circle of workers. You know, there's always that inner group. Jesus had an inner group. We think of the 12, but even in the 12, there was an inner group of Peter, James, and John. And so Luke and Demas were right in there. They were important enough to the work that Paul singled them out
to tell this church in Colossus that Luke and Demas send their greetings to you. And then in Philemon, verses 23 and 24, he is again listing these people. Paul is something like a sort of a creature of habit. He follows the same pattern in all of his doings. I have a minister friend who through the years has written me, and his letters always start with some flowery statement. Some talking about the goodness of God, or the lateness of the hour, and he can't just say Brother Moss and then start into the letter. That first paragraph is always something that is flowery. It is well thought out. If I ever got a letter from him that didn't start that way, I'd know it wasn't from him. Somebody else was writing for him. And Paul is much the same way. And he talks here about Epaphras. Somewhere, sometime, Epaphras and Paul probably got booked and fingerprinted together. They spent some time maybe as cellmates, or cells across the aisle from each other. But he calls him my fellow prisoner. He's been in jail like I've been in jail. We've both been arrested for preaching the gospel, and we are here in Philemon, and we're writing to you, Philemon, and I'm talking about Epaphras, and he salutes you. He sends his greetings. And also Marcus, who also wrote one of the Gospels, Aristarchus, Demas, and again Luke. And here he says Demas and Luke, particularly with these others, are my fellow laborers. He puts them on a par with him. He doesn't say these are my servants, these are the guys that run errands for me. No, he brings them up and he says they are a vital part of this work. Demas is right in there with me. When we're out on the street corner, when we're praying those all-night prayer meetings, when it's time for that late-night church service, Demas is there. I don't have to ever wonder about him. He's right there with me. He's like Lucas, he is my fellow laborer. And he is telling some great and grand things about Demas. Do you know how many people, I don't, but do you know how many people are mentioned in the Bible that we don't know their names? There's a prophet in the Old Testament that prophesied against Jeroboam. And he prophesied, and the altar split. The altar that Jeroboam was offering sacrifice to idols on, it split, and the ashes poured out, and he was a mighty man of God, but we don't know his name. Naaman was a mighty captain of the Syrian army, and he was a leper, but there was a little girl who'd been taken prisoner when Naaman and his company had made a raid into Israel. And she said to Naaman's wife, said, oh, that Naaman could go to Israel and there find the man of God. And because of her testimony, because of what she had said, Naaman, that great Assyrian captain, was healed of his leprosy, and Jesus even mentioned it during his ministry. It was that important. But we don't know that girl's name. The Bible is full of people that we don't know their names. They did great things, but we don't know who they were. But we do know Demas. We do know Demas was on a par with Luke as a worker. We do know that Demas was a fellow laborer. with the Apostle Paul. But then we have the very, very tragic news in Paul's writings to Timothy, his second letter to Timothy, when he says, be quick. Do everything you can to get here. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Until I began to study for this time, and I have talked about this in other places and other times, but I had never run across this before, that Demas, the name Demas, actually means popular. That's scary. Now, a lot of times names don't mean much. My first name, Roy, means king. Wrong. Lee can be from Leo, lion, King Lion. I don't think so. But in the Bible, a lot of times names have meaning. And I'm not sure if this is one of those times, but here's a man whose very core being may have been centered around his name of wanting to be popular. That can be a real dangerous position. If a man's ways please the Lord, he will make even his enemies to be at peace with him. You don't have to strive to be popular. If you live for God, God can take care of that as much as it needs to be taken care of if you'll do his way. What I wanted to preach about tonight, and I'll give you a title here so that you'll know where I'm going while I'm getting there. And the title of this tonight would be Scaffolding. Scaffolding. Demas was useful in the gospel work. He was, as I've already said, he was known as a fellow laborer, and he was listed with as prominent and productive personage as Luke, the beloved physician. But Demas, for all of his work, for all of the contribution he made to the work of God, somehow didn't last. He was in many ways like scaffolding. Now, there was something of this present world that called to him. I'll get back to that in just a little bit, but let me talk to you for a little bit about scaffolding, about bracing, about forms, because though I've just used the term scaffolding, all of these things are used in construction. Forms, bracing, scaffolding, and yet they don't always wind up as part of the building. Many years ago, and I'm so glad it was many years ago now. I'd never be able to do it again, but we in Bartlesville bought some property, and I designed a building, then got an architect to draw it out for us. And I acted as general contractor of putting up that church building in Bartlesville. And I worked everything from down digging the foundation to, I remember sitting up on the peak of the building, taking care of putting some shingles on 26 feet from the slab of the parking lot. And so I was involved in every aspect of that work. But when we poured the foundation, we took some 2x12 boards and we put them down on either side of where we wanted the foundation to be. And we'd drive stakes in the ground to hold those boards in the right place. And we got them all leveled up, all squared up, and then got the truck out there and poured concrete. And then when they got ready to pour the slab, we did it again. And put up the boards and got everything square and true and level and all of that kind of stuff. And that, when they came up with those big trucks of concrete and they began to dump that in there, and those guys, and the thing about it is you hardly ever see an overweight concrete worker. They just work it off of them. And they're out there moving that concrete around, and they move it over to those boards. And that's as far as it goes, because those forms hold it in place until it can set up and become solid and firm. And then when it's solid enough that it's not going to run on out, you take the boards off. And usually set them in a pile somewhere and wait and see if you need them for something else. After the concrete had set up for a few days, we had several of the other churches from around there. Men came up and brought their nail guns and their hammers and all the things that you need for putting up walls. This wasn't quite church in a day. It was more like church in 6 years. But on that one day, we made a lot of showing. We made a lot of progress, and they'd put those walls together, and then we'd get together and lift them up and try to true them up and get them square and straight and in line. And then we'd take 2x4s and we'd nail them in on an angle and brace that wall in place. And then we'd put up another wall and then another wall. And every time we put up a wall, we'd take bracing and brace it up. And then when we got that all done and we got the trusses on for the roof, the bracing came off. And it got put in a pile somewhere. See if we were going to use it. And as we went along, we would begin to work. And as I've told you, the peak of the roof was 26 feet high off of the slab. And really, we didn't have anybody that was 26 feet tall. And so we had to build scaffolding. And sometimes it was multi-layered scaffolding. I remember helping. I was there for helping to rock that building. And I'd get down and I'd take rocks and I'd put them up on the first layer, on that first set of scaffolding. And then I'd climb up there and I'd take those same rocks and I'd lift them up again. And finally we got them up to the third or fourth layer. And then the rock layer, he'd do all the work. I just took the rocks to him. He did all the work. And then when we got through, we'd tear the scaffolding down and go to the other end of the building, start reconstructing the scaffolding. And when we got through and put the last rock in, we tore the scaffolding down. Some of it had been made from the forms. Some of it had been made from the bracing. It was used again, but when we got through, there was some of that scaffolding that did not become part of the building. It was there, it was useful, but it was Demas. It played a part in the construction, but somehow it didn't make it into the building. Now, what many of you probably don't know is that for over 30 years, besides pastoring the church, I was also had a business as an insulation contractor. And I crawled around in attics putting insulation in attics and blew it into walls. And a lot of times I'd come in, or I'd climb in the pickup, and I'd taken my mask off and put it up on my forehead, just like that, and I'd look in the mirror in the pickup, and there was this ring right around here, and I had turned gray, and it wasn't even overnight. It was just during the day I'd turned gray, and then because of the moisture in my breath, this mask I'd be wearing, or had been wearing, would have turned black because it had gotten the cellulose wet. And so I've been in a lot of attics, and occasionally when I was crawling around in an attic, and by the way, if anybody wants to be an insulation contractor, remember to work in those attics, you've got to be about half monkey and half snake to crawl in, because the guy that designs it is usually not figuring on getting in there, and he doesn't make a nice big way to get through and where you need him to go. But so I would be up there, and occasionally I would come across a big board that was part of what they'd call a strong back that would hold the roof up and give it strength. And many times that board that was part of the strong back would have concrete on it. It had served a place as a form when they were pouring concrete. It had been pulled out and put somewhere else, but then later had been brought back and been used, and it became a permanent part of the building. Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. I've not gone through all of the steps that would be necessary to find out where all that Demas had worked. I don't know which churches stood solid and firm because Demas had played a part in holding the line until the gospel could be set firmly in the hearts of people. I don't know which places it might have been that he was bracing to hold them straight and true until they got some other things tied into their lives to hold them in a place where they didn't need that bracing anymore. I don't know of places where, all of the places where it may have been that rock upon rock of truth that was an outer shield for their lives was laid, because Demas was there as a scaffold to hold it in place, to make it possible for other workers to do their job and to build a strong wall that could hold people in living for God. I don't know all of the places, but there were several of them, I'm sure, because Paul called him my fellow laborer. He put him on a par with Luke the physician. And yet somehow, some way, there was something about Demas that though he was so involved in all of this building of gospel truth, that he was involved in reaching out to other people, that somehow he didn't get tied in to the building himself. Something called to him. Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. There's something of that present world 2,000 years ago that called to him, and he responded. I remember many, many years ago sitting in the office of Brother J.D. Drain, pastor of the church in Garland, Texas. I was a young man, 21 years old, just beginning a ministry. And Brother Drain was talking to me, and we covered a lot of he covered a lot of subjects that day. I was mainly listening. And he talked about my conversion. He said, you may not realize it, but there were many voices that were calling to you. And I could have filled him in on the voices that were calling to me. Engineering, I'd had a physician, a doctor, who had told me, if you'll become a doctor, I'll turn my practice over to you. A lawyer had told me, I'd like for you to become a lawyer and join our firm. There was just all kinds of things that were calling to me. The world was also calling. But he said, out of all of those voices, the voice of the Spirit called to you, and somehow, with everything else calling, you responded to the Spirit. I got a feeling there are a lot of folks sitting under the sound of my voice tonight that the same is true of you. Maybe not the same callings, but the world calls to all of us one way or another. And we've got to respond to the Spirit. But Demas responded to the call of the world. And he left the work of the ministry, left the work of living for God to go to that present world. Now, that seems kind of silly. Now, in a world of automobiles and airplanes, in a world of iPods, iPads, I don't know what else, somebody that would go to a world that really had nothing to offer, and to go there rather than the splendors of heaven that await God's people, that's a poor choice. And with all of our technology, and with all of the entertainments and things of this world, if we respond to the call of this present world, that's a poor choice. If we trade the splendors of heaven for even all of the wonders of today. This present world is always calling, and he responded. The present world always calls, and it always changes. That's the thing about the world. It changes. Just about the time you get something figured out, they come out with a new model. Just about the time you get your phone learned, about the time you get your apps under control, about the time you think you know what's going on. That's why I carry a phone that doesn't even have a capability of taking pictures. I know how to make a call. For a long, long time, Brother Beardsley he had his Mac. He knew how to work it, and Stephen couldn't talk him into anything else. He knew how that worked. That's plenty good. It worked. That's fine. And I've already told you in time past about how that Stephen is now dragging me kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And here I come. Praise the Lord. But the world's always changing. The world's always changing. Is there anybody here that's old enough to remember the flappers? Flappers of the 20s, maybe even into the 30s some. How about, and I'm going to leave this first couple of rows here out of this, because you may have seen it as retro, but how about the tie-dyed stuff? Oh, yeah. in high school, my best friend was a beatnik. Now, that's a predecessor of the hippies. We made quite a pair walking down the aisle of the school, down the hall. And here he was with his little goatee. And I'm walking next to him with a dress shirt and tie on. We were good friends. And then it went on into the tie-dyes, and I remember we had a bunch of young people come into the church in the early 70s, and I didn't pick up their language, but I did catch it. I didn't know what they were saying. You just have to be real careful to interpret what they're saying. Let me give you a quote that I heard several times. Man, like you know what I mean, like man. And the scary thing is I understood what they were talking about. But we don't have that anymore, except in a few time warps here and there. You look at old pictures, and in many of those old pictures, there was a time particularly in the 40s and so on, when all the men, when they were outside, wore hats. If they were a farmer, they wore one kind of hat. If they were a cowboy, they wore another kind of a hat. If they were in a town, they wore another kind of hat. But they all wore hats. And you can tell the good guys from the bad guys because the black hats, white hats, all that kind of stuff. Anyhow. Any of you used to have CB radio? Oh, yeah. What was your handle? Mine was north side, like the north side of a tree where the moss grows. Anybody got CB today in your car? I thought not. I remember when the big deal was a pager. I had a boy in the church, he was about 14 years old. He wanted a pager, he wanted a pager, he wanted a pager. You couldn't hear anything out of him, but he wanted a pager. So I asked him, what do you need a pager for? So my friends can get hold of me. I said, your friends are always with you. Why do they need a pager for them to get hold of you? How about music? Swing, jazz, rock, punk, rap, country, whatever the next thing is. I mentioned to, and this may, as the hippies would say, this may freak some of you out. But I asked a question one time, well, I asked it more than one time, but I said, what if we get to heaven? And out of all of the styles of music, from Gregorian chants to the Stripers, gospel Christian rock, to all the other stuff, what if we get there and we find out that God's favorite kind of music is rap? The second time I said that, there was a lady sitting right over on that side. She said, oh, Brother Moss, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. She knew where I was going, but I said it anyhow. But, the things that your parents fussed about your music, and now you fuss about the modern music, but it's this present world. It's always changing. The jazz, the rock, the swing, the punk, the rap, the country. If we sell out to this present world, we'll be nothing but scaffolding. I have been around places where the Department of Environmental Quality was nowhere to be seen around the building site. And the builder would start a fire. And he would burn up the leftover platforms, bracing, and scaffolding. See, I want to be part of the building. I want to be part of the building. I want to be part of the permanent part of what God's doing. And the way that we can be sure of doing that is to have a love for the work of God rather than for this present world. For the world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Praise God. Scaffolding can be used temporarily, but God's putting up a building that's going to last for eternity. And I want to be part of that building. I don't want to yield to the call, the siren call of this world when it calls to me and say, come on, look at all the pleasures of sin that are here. But it's only for a season. It's only for a while. Rock's going to be replaced by punk. Punk's going to be replaced by rap. Rap's going to be replaced by something else. CB radios are going to be replaced by your phone, and your phone may be replaced by an implant where you just, press on your chin and everything you hear, and the call comes through, and in the other ear you get a click, 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 and oh, hang on, I got to press here and take the other call. Oh man, I got to have that. I got to have that latest technology. I got to keep up with the Joneses. They're going to refinance, and you won't be able to keep up with them. My apologies to any Joneses that are here tonight, but you know what I mean. There's something worth being part of, and it's not this present world. It's a world, it's an eternity that's going to last and last and last. There's something about it that we can be part of it. And I remember I was visiting with Brother M.D. Deal. I believe at the time he was district secretary and later became the district superintendent. But I was either youth secretary or youth president, and we were just talking and covering all kinds of subjects. And a lot of times, if you just take time to talk to old people, I still try to do that. They'll teach you something if you just keep your ears open. They might. I read something today said there's that terrible spot in life that you reach where you realize that your parents were right about just about everything. But then Brother Deal told me, he said, son, remember this. While you're building, don't burn your scaffolding and don't shoot your decoys. In other words, he was saying that scaffolding might find a place in the building. There's a chance that what looked like it wasn't going to be much good can find a place in the building. I remember when I was in Bible college, we still did research and kept our notes on 3x5 note cards. Along about then, any computer that anybody had filled a building, a multi-story building. And you talked to it by punch cards. You'd have a whole stack of punch cards just to run one little program, one little problem. I remember, how many of you remember when they used to tell you that be a key punch operator, it's the job of the future. Nobody's doing that job today. That's part of that present world that keeps changing. But on the side of the file cabinet that I had for those 3x5 cards, I took one of them and I wrote on it words of a song. Surely there's a work that I can do. I had no idea at that time what lay ahead of me, what possibilities were there. 21 years old, just starting out, had the Holy Ghost at that point less than 3 years. I was willing to be a forum, to be bracing, to be scaffolding, anything to be involved in the work of God. I'm so thankful that God has allowed me to become part of his building. There's not that much difference between one 2x4 and another. But one of them becomes bracing and another becomes part of the wall. One of them is permanent and the other is just temporary. Demas has forsaken me. Scaffolding doesn't have any choice in the matter. The builder chooses. But we have a choice. We're all going to be called by this present world. In every one of us, there's something that loves what's going on around us now. But if we don't respond to that, but we respond to his word, to his love, to his call, we can be part of his building. Praise God. I want to be part of his building. Let's stand. Let's ask the Lord to make us part of that building that he's put in. Dear Jesus, we praise you tonight. Thank you for your mercies. God, for giving us even opportunity to be close to what you're doing. Help us, Lord, to walk with you, draw close to you, to love you where the siren song of this present world that's passing away doesn't appeal to us, but we walk with you and be what you want us to be. Help us, Lord. We need you. Jesus. Amen. Praise God. All right. Praise the Lord real quick.
Yes. I just want to thank everybody for praying for my daughter.
Yes.
And I actually talked to her. They sent her home. And the first time she had been surgery, they had been put the defibrillator. And this time they replaced it. But the first time she told it 2 times. What's the difference?
They sent her home? Oh my. Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord. Praise God. Praise God. Praise God. Praise the Lord. All right, everybody get your tickets out. The Ark will be leaving for the fellowship hall just right away. Lord bless you. Thank you so much for coming this evening.